Welcome everyone to our special episode titled English Boost. Learn faster, speak smarter. And before we dive into the heart of our conversation, let me extend my warm greetings to every learner, teacher, traveler, dreamer, and listener who has chosen to spend this time with us. Because today we are not just talking about learning English in the ordinary sense of memorizing words and repeating grammar drills, but rather about exploring together the idea that language can be mastered faster and spoken more intelligently if we understand how our brains actually absorb patterns, how our confidence shapes our voice, and how small, consistent actions can build massive fluency over time.
Thank you, Emma, and I must say that I am equally excited because in my many years of teaching and learning languages, I have realized that what makes someone truly succeed in acquiring English quickly and effectively is not only their access to books or lessons but rather the way they create daily habits, the way they push themselves gently but persistently outside their comfort zones, and the way they connect words to real emotions and experiences, which means that instead of just memorizing vocabulary lists, they actually live with the language, breathe with it, and let it become a natural part of their thought process.
Exactly, David. And if I can share something from my own journey, when I was younger and trying to improve my French, I wasted countless months thinking that buying bigger grammar books and downloading endless vocabulary apps would make me fluent. But in reality, the real boost came the moment I started speaking every single day, even to myself in the mirror, even if my sentences were broken or my accent was heavy, because by allowing myself to practice without fear, I unlocked a rhythm in my brain that made my learning so much faster. And this is the same principle I encourage every English learner to embrace. Practice out loud, every single day, without worrying about mistakes.
That resonates so much with me, Emma, because many learners forget that fluency is not perfection but rather communication, and if someone spends their energy trying to be perfect before they even open their mouth, they will stay silent for years. But if instead they choose to speak boldly, make mistakes publicly, and laugh at themselves kindly, then every mistake becomes a stepping stone, every conversation becomes a classroom, and every effort builds the muscles of language, which means the path to speaking smarter is actually paved by courage rather than flawless grammar.
And this is why we titled today's podcast English Boost. Learn faster, speak smarter, because learning faster is not about rushing or pressuring yourself. It is about finding smarter strategies that save time, like focusing on the 20% of vocabulary that is used in 80% of daily conversations, or training your ear with active listening to podcasts, movies, and songs so that your brain starts recognizing natural patterns, or using tools like shadowing where you repeat after a speaker in real time, which not only improves pronunciation but also develops natural rhythm and intonation, and all of these together accelerate progress in ways that endless worksheets simply cannot.
You said something very important there, Emma, and I want to expand on it because many learners underestimate the power of listening, and they believe that studying grammar alone will carry them forward, but in truth, grammar is like the skeleton of the language while listening is the oxygen that gives life to the skeleton. And when you listen actively, when you pause and mimic the intonation of a native speaker, when you recognize the melody of questions versus statements, you are not only improving your comprehension but also training your subconscious brain to speak smarter without overthinking rules, which is the true beauty of immersive learning.
Yes, and I think it's also worth mentioning that environment plays a huge role, and of course many learners will say, "But Emma, I don't live in an English-speaking country." And to that I always reply that your environment is not only your geography but also your choices, because with the internet you can fill your day with English voices, you can change your phone to English, you can follow English-speaking creators on social media, and you can join communities where people practice together. And when you create an English-rich environment, even if your family or city doesn't speak the language, you are giving yourself the daily exposure necessary to boost both speed and intelligence in your learning journey.
That is absolutely true, and I would add that motivation is another essential element, because learning a language is not just a technical project but an emotional adventure, and if a learner ties their English learning to their bigger dreams, maybe to get a better job, maybe to study abroad, maybe to connect with people they admire, then every practice session becomes meaningful, every word learned carries personal value, and that meaning is what fuels consistency, because without consistent practice no strategy will work. But with meaningful motivation, even the hardest grammar rules and the longest vocabulary lists become manageable stepping stones rather than obstacles.
You're reminding me, David, of a student I once had who was incredibly shy and always afraid of speaking, but when she discovered that her favorite K-pop idols gave interviews in English, she suddenly had a reason to listen, a reason to imitate, and a reason to step out of her fear. And within 6 months, she had made more progress than in the previous 2 years combined, which proves that when learning is tied to something we love, our brains absorb faster and our hearts speak smarter. And that is a principle every listener here can apply in their own life immediately.
That's such a beautiful example, and I think it illustrates another truth that often goes unspoken, which is that language learning is not only an academic pursuit but also an identity-building process, because every time we learn new words or expressions, we are not just storing information but expanding the way we think, the way we see the world, and the way we present ourselves. So when someone says, "I want to speak smarter," what they really mean is, "I want to think more clearly, more broadly, and more empathetically," and English, being a global language, offers that opportunity if we are willing to embrace its richness with patience and creativity.
Absolutely. And speaking of creativity, one of the most overlooked yet powerful methods of boosting English is storytelling, because when you tell a story, even a simple one about your day, you practice sequence, you practice tenses, you practice vocabulary and context, and most importantly, you practice expressing ideas clearly. And the more you practice storytelling in English, whether through journaling, recording your voice, or sharing with a friend, the more confident and intelligent your communication becomes, because stories are how humans naturally connect, and if you can tell your story in English, you're already speaking smarter than you think.
And stories are also memorable, Emma, which is why I often encourage learners to stop obsessing over single words in isolation and instead focus on learning chunks or phrases that appear in real-life contexts, because when you memorize, "Can you help me with this?" as a complete phrase rather than analyzing each word separately, your brain recalls it more quickly, and when you collect dozens or hundreds of such phrases, you suddenly find yourself speaking fluently without hesitation, which is another way of learning faster while simultaneously sounding smarter.
That's brilliant, David. And I would add that technology can be a wonderful ally here, because in today's world we have voice recognition apps, AI tutors, online language partners, and digital flashcards that remind us at the perfect time with spaced repetition. And while I always tell students not to become slaves to their screens, I do emphasize that smart use of these tools can accelerate progress significantly, provided they remember that technology is a supplement, not a substitute, for real human communication, because ultimately speaking smarter comes from speaking with people, not just with machines.
Well said, and since we are approaching the final stretch of our conversation, I want to underline something simple yet profound, which is that every learner listening right now already has the ability to improve rapidly if they choose to make English part of their daily life rather than a distant goal, and this means talking to yourself, labeling things in your house, sending voice notes to friends, watching shows with subtitles, and even dreaming in English. Because once the language enters your everyday routine, the speed of improvement doubles and your confidence grows in ways you never imagined possible.
Yes, and let me wrap this thought in a clear message for everyone listening. Don't wait for the perfect time, the perfect course, or the perfect level to start speaking, because the fastest learners and the smartest speakers are the ones who start imperfectly today, who practice consistently tomorrow, and who look back after a year realizing they have built something extraordinary from small daily actions. So remember that your English boost begins the moment you decide to act, and that decision can be right now, as soon as this podcast ends.
And before we dive deeper into these strategies, I want to remind every listener that learning a language is not a linear process, and sometimes the moments that feel like setbacks are actually the most powerful accelerators of growth, because they force you to reflect, adapt, and discover approaches that suit your brain, your lifestyle, and your personality in ways that rigid study alone never could.
And another important point I want to emphasize, David, is that sometimes learners get frustrated when progress seems slow, but in reality, language acquisition is like planting a tree. You water it every day, give it sunlight, and though growth may not be visible immediately, over time the roots deepen and the branches stretch, which means consistency and patience are far more valuable than speed, because every effort compounds quietly and eventually produces fluency that feels effortless.
Absolutely, Emma, and to add to that, it's also essential to celebrate small wins, because when learners notice that they understood a sentence without translating, or that they responded confidently in a conversation, or that they remembered a tricky phrase spontaneously, these moments build motivation exponentially, proving that progress is happening even when it feels invisible. And recognizing these milestones is what keeps the journey sustainable and joyful.
I also want to highlight that making English part of your identity is crucial, because when you start thinking of yourself as someone who speaks English naturally, rather than someone who is trying to learn, your brain automatically adapts to act in alignment with that identity, which changes not only how you speak but also how you approach challenges, mistakes, and opportunities to communicate, creating a mental environment where fluency grows organically.
That's a key insight, Emma, and I would add that curiosity fuels this process in ways that structured learning alone cannot, because when learners ask questions about new words, explore idioms they find in movies, or wonder why native speakers say things differently, they are engaging their brains in problem solving rather than rote memorization, and this deeper engagement makes the language stick longer and allows them to use it more creatively in real-life conversations.
And something else I've noticed in my experience is that learners often underestimate the power of writing as a tool for speaking, because when you write emails, journals, or even social media posts in English, you are practicing vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structure simultaneously. And when you read your writing aloud, you are effectively rehearsing conversations, which means writing is not just a passive activity, but a direct accelerator of both speed and intelligence in communication.
I agree, Emma, and I think another overlooked strategy is the use of analogies and personal connections, because when learners link a new English word or phrase to a personal memory, a funny story, or a vivid image, their brain encodes it more strongly, making recall faster, and over time, this method builds a network of meaningful language connections that feel natural and allow speakers to express themselves with nuance, confidence, and creativity.
It's also fascinating how pronunciation and intonation can completely change how listeners perceive your intelligence, because when learners pay attention to the melody of sentences, the stress patterns, and the rise and fall of pitch, they can convey clarity, confidence, and emotional nuance, which not only makes them sound smarter, but also improves comprehension for both themselves and the listener, creating a virtuous cycle of speaking and understanding that reinforces fluency.
And another aspect that can't be ignored is the role of peer learning, because when learners interact with others at a similar level, share mistakes, teach each other new words, and provide encouragement, they experience a social form of practice that is both motivating and highly effective, because the act of explaining a concept or correcting a friend reinforces knowledge more deeply than solo study ever could, and it also builds communication instincts that last a lifetime.
Moreover, incorporating humor and playfulness into learning can drastically increase both speed and retention, because when learners enjoy the process, through jokes, word games, improvisation, or funny recordings, they reduce anxiety, increase engagement, and make the language memorable, which demonstrates that boosting English is not only about discipline but also about creating positive emotional experiences that your brain associates with success.
Finally, Emma, I want to emphasize that reflection is a hidden superpower, because when learners pause to think about what they understood, what mistakes they made, and what patterns they noticed during a conversation, they consolidate knowledge, correct errors internally, and build strategies for the next encounter, which means that even quiet, mindful moments of review contribute massively to learning faster, speaking smarter, and ultimately becoming a confident, self-directed English communicator. To all our wonderful listeners, thank you for spending this hour with us on English Boost. Learn faster, speak smarter, and I hope you carry away the belief that your journey to fluency is not only possible but also exciting, rewarding, and deeply transformative if you allow yourself patience, creativity, and courage along the way.
And from my heart to yours, I wish you all joy and confidence in your English adventure, and I invite you to share your stories, practice boldly, and never forget that every single step you take makes you a smarter, faster, and stronger speaker. So until next time, keep learning, keep speaking, and keep shining. Goodbye for now.